How does a kingdom not just survive one Mongol invasion, but 6 consecutive assaults over 7 years? How does a fortress withstand an enemy that had already conquered everything from China to Eastern Europe? An army that left pyramids of skulls in cities that dared resist them. Between 1299 and 1306, the Delhi Sultanate faced something no other kingdom had successfully endured. Repeated, massive Mongol invasions led by commanders who had watched Genghis Khan's sons crush empires. The defenders weren't fighting just for territory. They were standing between the Mongol horde and the complete erasure of Indo-Islamic civilization from the subcontinent. What made Delhi different? What secret advantages did Sultan Alauddin Khalji possess that the Khwarezmian Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, and dozens of other kingdoms lacked? The answer lies not in one dramatic battle, but in a brutal 7-year war of attrition that transformed military thinking and created fortress defenses so formidable that even the grandsons of Genghis Khan learned to fear them. To understand why Delhi's survival seemed impossible, you need to grasp what the Mongols had already accomplished by 1299. This wasn't some regional power probing India's borders. This was the Chagatai Khanate, one of 4 successor states carved from Genghis Khan's empire, controlling everything from the Caspian Sea to the borders of China. Their forces had annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire in 1220, killing an estimated 1.25 million people in the city of Merv alone. They had sacked Baghdad in 1258, ending the Abbasid Caliphate that had ruled for 5 centuries, reportedly massacring between 200,000 and 1,000 inhabitants and throwing so many books into the Tigris. The chroniclers claimed the river ran black with ink. When the Mongols invaded Kievan Rus in 1237 to 1242, they destroyed virtually every major city, with some losing 90% of their populations. The Mongol military machine operated with terrifying efficiency. Highly mobile cavalry units that could cover 60 miles per day, composite bows with a 350-yard effective range that outclassed anything their enemies possessed, and psychological warfare tactics designed to make surrender seem like the only rational option. The Delhi Sultanate in 1299 faced unique vulnerabilities that made Mongol conquest seem inevitable. The kingdom stretched across northern India, from the Indus River to Bengal, but Sultan Alauddin Khalji had seized power just 2 years earlier by murdering his uncle and predecessor, Jalaluddin Khalji. Internal legitimacy remained weak, with potential rivals watching for any sign of weakness. The Sultanate's military relied heavily on cavalry, but their horses were smaller than Mongol ponies, and their composite bows inferior in range and penetration. Previous sultans had faced Mongol raids throughout the 1280s and 1290s, generally responding by retreating behind fortifications or paying tribute. The northwestern frontier, centered on Multan and Punjab, had already been repeatedly devastated by Mongol raids that depopulated entire regions. Local governors often fled at the first sight of Mongol scouts, abandoning their territories to be plundered. The geography seemed to favor the invaders. The northwestern approaches from Afghanistan through mountain passes offered multiple invasion routes, and the flat plains of Punjab allowed Mongol cavalry to operate with maximum mobility. But here's what changed everything. Alauddin Khalji didn't just prepare to survive Mongol attacks. He prepared to destroy them so thoroughly that the psychological advantage would shift to Delhi. And he didn't have much time to implement his vision. The crisis erupted in December 1299 when a Mongol force estimated at between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors, led by Kutlug Khwaja, grandson of Genghis Khan's son Chagatai, crossed the Indus River and began advancing toward Delhi itself. This wasn't a raid for plunder. This was a conquest expedition designed to incorporate northern India into the Chagatai Khanate permanently. The Mongols bypassed frontier fortresses, knowing that speed would prevent Delhi from organizing effective resistance. Local governors sent desperate messages to the capital. The enemy was moving faster than expected. Their numbers were overwhelming, and they were executing anyone who resisted while enslaving those who surrendered. By early January 1300, Mongol advance units reached the vicinity of Delhi, camping within sight of the city walls. Alauddin faced a decision: retreat behind fortifications and hope the Mongols would withdraw, or meet them in open battle where their cavalry superiority could prove decisive. Most of his advisors urged caution, reminding him of previous disasters when Muslim armies had tried to match Mongol mobility in open terrain. Alauddin chose to fight, but not the way previous commanders had fought. He assembled an army of approximately 40,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry, significantly outnumbered but concentrated rather than scattered across multiple garrisons. He appointed his most trusted commander, Zafar Khan, to lead the vanguard, while he personally commanded the center. Crucially, Alauddin had spent the previous 2 years reorganizing military logistics. He established a network of supply depots between Delhi and the frontier, ensuring his forces wouldn't face the food shortages that had crippled previous campaigns. He recruited heavily from Afghan and Turkic warriors who had fought against Mongols before and understood their tactics. Most importantly, he instituted what contemporary chroniclers called the branding system, marking every horse in his cavalry to prevent corruption and ensure commanders couldn't falsely inflate their troop numbers to collect extra pay. This meant his 40,000 cavalry were real, properly equipped, and actually present, unlike the phantom armies that had supposedly defended the Sultanate in previous decades. The preparation phase revealed Alauddin's strategic genius. He studied accounts of Mongol defeats, particularly the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where Mamluk forces from Egypt had defeated a Mongol army by using feigned retreats to disrupt their formations. He learned from the disaster at Jalandhar in 1298, where a Sultanate army had been destroyed because it broke formation chasing Mongol scouts, only to be surrounded and massacred. Alauddin instituted strict discipline codes. Cavalry units were forbidden from pursuing fleeing enemies without explicit orders, a rule enforced by immediate execution for violations. He also fortified Delhi's approaches, establishing fortified camps at strategic locations where his forces could operate from secure bases rather than maneuvering in open country. According to the contemporary historian Ziauddin Bahrani, Alauddin told his commanders, "The Mongols have never faced an enemy who refused to play their game. We will anchor ourselves to fortifications, force them to attack prepared positions, and bleed them until they learn that India is not Khwarezm." The first major engagement occurred in January 1300 near Kili, just outside Delhi. Mongol forces, eager to capture the capital before reinforcements arrived, launched probing attacks against Sultanate positions. Zafar Khan commanded approximately 10,000 cavalry in the vanguard, positioned behind a series of ditches and wooden barriers that nullified the Mongol advantage in mobility. The Mongols attempted their classic tactic: wave after wave of mounted archers riding close enough to launch arrows, then wheeling away before defenders could respond effectively. But Alauddin had deployed crossbowmen recruited from Chinese and Central Asian refugees who had fled Mongol conquest. These crossbows, with effective ranges of 400 yards, could match Mongol composite bows. The initial clashes produced roughly equal casualties, perhaps 2,000 on each side. But this parity represented a psychological victory for Delhi. The Mongols expected easy dominance. Instead, they faced an enemy that had studied their methods and developed countermeasures. Over the next 3 weeks, a brutal stalemate developed. Mongol forces couldn't bypass Delhi without leaving a hostile army on their supply lines, but direct assault on fortified positions produced unacceptable casualties. Kutlug Khwaja tried to lure Sultanate forces into open battle by ravaging nearby villages, but Alauddin refused to take the bait. Contemporary chronicles describe horrific scenes. Mongol warriors herding captured villagers toward Delhi's walls, then massacring them in full view of defenders to provoke an emotional response. Alauddin reportedly ordered his troops to watch without reacting, reminding them that premature action would doom the entire kingdom. The winter cold worked in Delhi's favor. Mongol ponies, adapted to Central Asian steppes, struggled in India's winter rains. Supply lines stretched back toward Afghanistan began to falter as local populations fled or destroyed food stocks. By late January 1300, Kutlug Khwaja recognized that his conquest expedition had stalled, but rather than withdraw empty-handed, he decided to force a decisive battle by directly assaulting one of Alauddin's fortified camps at Amroha, roughly 70 miles from Delhi. This was exactly what Alauddin had been waiting for. The Battle of Amroha became the first of 6 major confrontations, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. Kutlug Khwaja assembled approximately 50,000 of his best cavalry for a concentrated assault on the fortified camp, which held about 15,000 Sultanate troops under Zafar Khan. The Mongols attacked at dawn on February 6, 1300, expecting to overwhelm the position through sheer numbers and ferocity. The defenders had constructed 3 concentric rings of ditches backed by wooden palisades. With cavalry held in reserve behind the innermost defenses, Mongol mounted archers opened the battle with a traditional arrow storm, launching thousands of arrows into the defensive positions from 200 to 300 yards distance. But the defenders remained protected behind their barriers, while crossbowmen and archers responded with their own volleys. After 2 hours of this exchange, with perhaps 500 casualties on each side but no breakthrough, Kutlug Khwaja committed his shock cavalry to break the defenses directly. This was the critical moment. Mongol heavy cavalry, equipped with lances and sabers, charged toward the outer ditch line while archers provided covering fire. The first wave reached the ditches only to discover they were deeper than expected, 8 feet deep and too wide for horses to jump. Warriors tried to dismount and cross on foot, but this eliminated their mobility advantage and made them vulnerable to defenders on the palisades above. The attack stalled in bloody chaos. Zafar Khan now unleashed his counterstroke. Cavalry units positioned at gaps in the defenses launched coordinated charges into the flanks of Mongol formations trapped at the ditches. The Mongols, caught between the fortifications in front and cavalry charges from the sides, found their formations disrupted. What followed was close-quarters slaughter. Contemporary accounts, likely exaggerated but indicative of the battle's intensity, claim 12,000 Mongols died at Amroha, while Sultanate losses reached 3,000. More importantly, Kutlug Khwaja himself barely escaped, and his army's morale shattered. Within 3 days, the entire Mongol expedition began withdrawing toward Afghanistan. You might think that was enough to secure Delhi's safety. Wrong. The Mongols viewed their 1300 defeat as a temporary setback, not a strategic failure. By late 1301, a new invasion force of approximately 80,000 warriors crossed into Punjab. This time commanded by Targi and accompanied by several experienced generals who had participated in campaigns across Eurasia. They adopted different tactics, avoiding Delhi initially, and instead conquering territory in Punjab and Multan to establish a secure base for future operations. Over the course of 1302, Mongol forces systematically occupied the northwestern provinces, defeating local garrisons and establishing their own administrators. Alauddin faced a dilemma. If he allowed the Mongols to consolidate control of Punjab, they would eventually advance on Delhi from a position of strength, with secure supply lines and strategic depth. Alauddin's response demonstrated his understanding of strategic patience. Rather than immediately marching his main army to confront the Mongols in Punjab, he launched a series of devastating raids into their newly conquered territory. Small, highly mobile Sultanate cavalry units, typically 3,000–5,000 strong, would strike Mongol supply convoys, massacre isolated garrisons, and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. This guerrilla campaign prevented the Mongols from establishing stable administration. According to Barani, Alauddin ordered his raiders to be utterly ruthless. Give no quarter, take no prisoners, leave nothing standing. The goal was to make occupation so costly that the Mongols would either commit to a major expedition against Delhi, where Alauddin wanted to fight them, or withdraw entirely. The raids worked. By mid-1303, frustrated Mongol commanders assembled another massive force, this time reportedly reaching 120,000 warriors, for a direct assault on Delhi. Targi's army marched straight for the capital, determined to end the Sultanate once and for all. The siege of Delhi in 1303 represented the greatest crisis Alauddin faced. The Mongol army arrived in October and immediately surrounded the city, cutting off supply routes and beginning preparations for a full-scale assault. Delhi's fortifications, built and expanded over decades, consisted of massive stone walls with towers and gates. But previous sieges throughout history had shown that determined attackers with sufficient numbers could eventually breach any defense. Alauddin had approximately 30,000 troops within the city, along with perhaps 300,000 civilians. The Mongols began constructing siege engines, catapults, and battering rams, while their archers maintained constant harassment of the walls to prevent effective counterattacks. Contemporary sources describe the psychological pressure. Mongol warriors would ride up to the walls and shout descriptions of what they had done to other cities, promising that Delhi's inhabitants would face even worse unless they surrendered immediately. But here's the twist that saved Delhi. Alauddin had spent the previous 3 years not just training armies, but building an intelligence network. Spies and informants within Mongol-controlled Punjab provided detailed information about enemy supply lines, leadership conflicts, and morale problems. Alauddin learned that Targi's massive army was already experiencing food shortages. Feeding 120,000 warriors and their horses required enormous quantities of supplies, and the scorched earth tactics from 1302's raiding campaign meant Punjab couldn't provide sufficient provisions. More critically, Alauddin received intelligence that a significant portion of the Mongol force consisted of recently conquered Central Asian warriors whose loyalty to the Chagatai Khanate remained questionable. These warriors had been forcibly incorporated into Mongol armies and might defect if circumstances turned against their overlords. The siege lasted 2 months, but the Mongols never attempted a full assault. Instead, they probed the defenses, launched limited attacks to test different sections of the wall, and waited for starvation to force Delhi's surrender. Alauddin countered by rationing food supplies and organizing the civilian population into support roles. Women and children carried water and supplies to defenders on the walls. Craftsmen repaired damaged sections at night, and everyone participated in maintaining morale through communal prayers and celebrations. The Sultan personally toured the walls daily, visible to both his own troops and the besieging Mongols, demonstrating that leadership hadn't fled. By December 1303, with winter weather worsening and their own supplies critically low, the Mongol commanders faced a choice: assault the walls and accept horrific casualties, or withdraw and admit failure. They chose withdrawal, but with a twist of their own. They devastated the countryside around Delhi as they retreated, destroying crops and villages to demonstrate that even in defeat, they could inflict terrible punishment. Little did anyone realize that this wouldn't be the last invasion. Not even close. The Mongols returned in 1304, this time with approximately 60,000 warriors led by Iqbalmand and Ali Beg. They tried yet another approach. Rapid raids deep into Sultanate territory, bypassing fortifications entirely and targeting economic centers. Mongol cavalry units struck cities in the Gangetic Plain, including areas that had never before faced Central Asian invaders, causing panic throughout the kingdom. Alauddin responded with his now perfected defensive system. He had established a network of fortified towns and cities across his territory, each capable of withstanding a siege for several weeks. When Mongol raiders approached, local populations retreated behind walls while messengers alerted regional armies. Sultanate cavalry, now organized into rapid response forces stationed at strategic locations, would converge on the raiders from multiple directions. The Mongols found themselves hunted rather than hunting. The decisive engagement of the 1304 campaign occurred at Amroha again. Yes, the same location where they had been defeated 4 years earlier. It seems the Mongols believed they could reverse their previous disaster, or perhaps the site's location made it strategically unavoidable. Iqbalmand commanded roughly 30,000 cavalry in a concentrated force, while Alauddin dispatched an army of 25,000 under the command of Malik Kafur, one of his most capable generals who had risen from slavery to command through proven military genius. The battle on March 15, 1304, lasted from mid-morning until dusk. Unlike the 1300 battle, this engagement featured more open field maneuvering. Malik Kafur deployed his cavalry in 3 divisions, a center force that engaged the Mongols directly, and 2 wing formations that attempted the classic pincer movement. The Mongols, experienced in this type of warfare, countered by refusing their flanks, pulling back their wing formations while concentrating strength in the center to break through Malik Kafur's main force. The crisis came around midday when the Mongol center successfully broke the first line of Sultanate cavalry, threatening to split the army and destroy its cohesion. Malik Kafur, watching from a hill behind his lines, committed his reserve force of 5,000 heavy cavalry armed with lances and protected by chainmail. These shock troops crashed into the Mongol breakthrough, trading mobility for devastating impact. The Mongols, expecting to exploit their success, instead found themselves locked in grinding close combat against heavily armored opponents. Neither side would yield. Casualties mounted horrifically. Contemporary estimates suggest 8,000 Sultanate and 10,000 Mongol deaths. Though these numbers are likely exaggerated, the ratio probably reflects reality. As sunset approached, with both armies exhausted, Iqbalmand ordered withdrawal. Malik Kafur, following Alauddin's standing orders against reckless pursuit, let them go ours. The Mongols retreated back toward Punjab, having accomplished nothing except adding to the death toll. But the invasions continued. In 1305, another Mongol expedition, this time approximately 50,000 strong under Ali Beg in Tartak, invaded with a new strategy. They would occupy territory gradually, establishing permanent camps and importing settlers from Central Asia to create a buffer zone that would eventually expand into the Sultanate's heartland. This represented perhaps the most dangerous approach yet, because it aimed not for quick conquest, but gradual absorption. Alauddin's response revealed his evolved strategic thinking. He launched a preemptive offensive into Mongol-controlled Punjab, attacking their fortified camps before they could consolidate. This was risky. It meant fighting the Mongols on their chosen ground. But Alauddin calculated that destroying their forward bases would be less costly than allowing them to strengthen over months or years. The campaign of 1305-1306 consisted of dozens of smaller engagements rather than one dramatic battle. Sultanate forces, now numbering around 80,000 troops across multiple armies, systematically assaulted Mongol positions throughout Punjab. Each fortified camp required a miniature siege, surrounding the position, cutting off supplies, then assaulting with infantry, while cavalry prevented reinforcements from arriving. At the camp near Jalandhar, Sultanate forces commanded by Ghazi Malik, who would later become Sultan himself, spent 3 weeks besieging 1,000 Mongol defenders. The final assault on February 20, 1306, cost 1,500 Sultanate lives, but resulted in the complete annihilation of the garrison. According to chroniclers, Alauddin had ordered that captured Mongol warriors be given a choice: convert to Islam and join Sultanate armies, or face execution. Most chose execution, demonstrating the fierce loyalty the Mongol system instilled even in warriors who faced certain death. Can you imagine the psychological transformation that occurred over these 7 years? The Mongols, who had terrorized the known world for nearly a century, who had made entire kingdoms pay tribute simply to avoid invasion, gradually learned that Delhi was different. Their 6th and final major invasion in late 1306 revealed this shift. A force of approximately 40,000 Mongols crossed into Sultanate territory, but this time they avoided major fortifications entirely. They raided border regions, collected whatever plunder they could seize quickly, and withdrew within weeks. This wasn't conquest. It was acknowledgement of limits. The Chagatai Khanate had concluded that incorporating northern India would cost more in warriors and resources than any potential benefit justified. Chronicles from the period record that Mongol commanders told their troops, "The land beyond the Indus belongs to the Sultan of Delhi. Let him keep it." The consequences of Delhi's survival extended far beyond the immediate military victories. Economically, Alauddin's military reforms had required massive expenditure. Maintaining standing armies of 80,000, 100,000 troops cost approximately 30 million silver tankas annually, equivalent to perhaps 40% of the Sultanate's entire revenue. To fund this, Alauddin implemented ruthless taxation and price controls that squeezed every possible resource from his kingdom's economy. He confiscated noble estates, regulated market prices for essential goods, and established a spy network to prevent tax evasion. These measures created prosperity for soldiers and urban populations while impoverishing the agricultural aristocracy. The social consequences lasted for generations, concentrating power in the Sultan's hands in ways that previous rulers had never achieved. Geopolitically, Delhi's successful resistance changed the trajectory of South Asian history. If the Mongols had conquered northern India in 1300 to 1306, the region's political development would have followed the pattern of Central Asia and Persia. Incorporation into a vast Mongol-dominated empire, followed by eventual fragmentation into smaller khanates. Instead, the Delhi Sultanate survived to dominate northern India for another 2 centuries, spreading Islamic culture and creating the foundation for the later Mughal Empire. The military lessons Alauddin developed: fortification-based defense combined with mobile cavalry reserves, intelligence networks for strategic warning, professional standing armies with merit-based leadership, became standard practice for subsequent Indian kingdoms. The human cost deserves acknowledgement too. Contemporary estimates suggest that the 7 years of warfare resulted in approximately 500,000 deaths from combat, disease, and famine across both sides. The repeated devastation of Punjab's agricultural regions created refugee crises as populations fled towards safer areas. Entire villages disappeared from tax records, indicating total abandonment or destruction. The Mongols suffered perhaps near 80,000, 100,000 warrior casualties across all campaigns, a significant drain on Chagatai Khanate manpower that contributed to their later decline. For Delhi, The constant military mobilization created a generation of veterans whose expectations of reward and status would create political instability after Alauddin's death in 1316. The extended aftermath revealed the fragility of Alauddin's achievement. His military success depended on his personal authority and strategic genius. After his death, the centralized system he created began fracturing as nobles and generals competed for power. The Sultanate faced internal rebellions in 1317 to 1320 that killed more Muslims than all the Mongol invasions combined. Regional governors, empowered by Alauddin to resist Mongol attacks independently, now used those same military resources to assert autonomy from Delhi. The Tughlaq dynasty that eventually consolidated power in 1320 inherited Alauddin's military structure, but never replicated his strategic coherence. Mongol raids resumed on a smaller scale in the 1320s, 1330s, though these never again threatened Delhi's existence. The psychological barrier had been established. India's heartland had proven unconquerable. This defensive triumph achieved what no other Islamic kingdom had managed in the 13th, 14th centuries. It stopped Mongol expansion at full strength, rather than benefiting from Mongol weakness or distraction. When the Mamluks defeated Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, they faced an expedition force operating at the extreme end of long supply lines, and Mongol attention was divided by succession crises. When Mongol expansion into Europe ended in 1242, it stopped because of the death of the Great Khan and resulting political turmoil, not military defeat. Delhi's resistance, by contrast, occurred while the Chagatai Khanate was stable, well supplied via Afghan routes, and focused specifically on conquering India. The victories from 1299 to 1306 represented genuine military superiority in defensive warfare, developed through systematic learning and institutional reform. If Delhi had fallen in 1300 or 1303, Indian civilization would have faced cultural devastation comparable to what befell Persia and Central Asia. The Mongol conquest of those regions destroyed centuries-old irrigation systems, collapsed urban centers, and reduced populations by an estimated 30–50% through direct killing and subsequent famine. The great centers of Islamic learning, Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, never fully recovered from Mongol destruction. Delhi housed similar cultural treasures: libraries containing Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic manuscripts, architectural monuments representing Indo-Islamic synthesis, communities of scholars and artists who had fled Mongol advances elsewhere. The preservation of this cultural capital meant that when the Mongols themselves eventually converted to Islam and adopted Persian culture, Delhi remained an independent center that influenced rather than being influenced by Central Asian developments. The military legacy deserves particular emphasis. Alauddin's defensive system proved that disciplined infantry and cavalry, operating from fortified positions, could defeat supposedly invincible Mongol mobility. This lesson influenced military thinking across Asia. Chinese generals facing Mongol remnants in the 14th century studied reports of Delhi's methods. Ottoman military theorists in the 15th century incorporated elements of Sultanate defensive doctrine into their own systems. The idea that fortification networks combined with mobile reserves could control large territories against numerically superior enemies became fundamental to early modern warfare. Alauddin didn't invent these concepts, but he proved their effectiveness against history's most successful conquerors. Who deserves credit for this achievement? Alauddin Khalji remains a controversial figure even today. His domestic policies bordered on tyrannical. Mass executions of suspected traitors, confiscation of noble wealth, invasive surveillance systems, and ruthless suppression of dissent. His taxation policies impoverished the rural aristocracy to fund military expansion. Yet his strategic vision and willingness to reform Failed systems saved the Delhi Sultanate when conventional wisdom suggested accommodation with the Mongols was the only rational policy. Commanders like Zafar Khan, Malik Kafur, and Ghazi Malik deserve equal recognition for tactical execution and personal bravery. The anonymous soldiers who held defensive positions against overwhelming numbers, who maintained discipline when flight seemed sensible, who returned campaign after campaign despite horrific casualties. They created the foundation that strategy and tactics built upon. This 7-year war changed history not through one dramatic moment, but through persistent strategic defense that gradually convinced an empire to seek easier conquests elsewhere. The Mongols learned that some kingdoms couldn't be broken, that some walls wouldn't fall, that some armies adapted faster than conquerors could innovate. Delhi's survival ensured that South Asian civilization developed independently rather than as a province of a Central Asian empire, preserving cultural diversity and creating the foundation for centuries of subsequent history. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most consequential defensive victories. If you found this exploration of Delhi's resistance valuable, help us reach more history enthusiasts by hitting that like button. Let's push past 1,000 likes in the next 24 hours. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss future videos on military history's most fascinating campaigns. And here's a question for the comments. Which battle or campaign should we analyze next? Should we explore how Ethiopia defeated Italy in 1896, making it the only African nation never colonized? Or dive into the Japanese repulse of Mongol invasions in the 1270s-1280s? Let me know below, and I'll see you in the next video where we continue uncovering the battles that changed the world.